Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ellen Davis, Executive Vice President for Industry Engagement at the Consumer Brands Association. We're excited you've joined us for this afternoon's Industry Solutions session. This series provides insights for CPG companies presented by premier partners of consumer brands. PwC is among the leading professional services networks in the world. They help organizations and individuals create the value they're looking for. In addition to their work with clients, PwC serves as one of consumer brands' premier strategic partners. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Julie Bogus, Partner, ESG Advisory for PwC. Julie has more than 20 years of experience helping clients undertake ambitious programs to successfully transform their sustainability, finance, IT, risk, and compliance capabilities. Julie has focused on ESG and sustainability for more than 10 years and has experience in ESG strategy, goal setting, training, and data governance and technology. So quite a bit. During today's session, Julie will present tools and strategies that take a focused, proactive approach to ESG reporting that aligns with corporate strategy and provides ESG metrics and performance data that investors and company leaders expect. It's certainly an important topic at a critical time. We have saved time at the end of today's session for audience Q&A. So if you've got a question, we encourage you to use the bottom button on your screen to submit it during the session itself using the Q&A panel at the bottom. Julie, welcome. We're so excited to have you share your expertise with our attendees today.
Thanks, Ellen. Thanks so much for having me. As Ellen mentioned, I'm excited to talk to you about the topic today. And actually, the way I got involved in sustainability and ESG consulting was through the reporting route, through an opportunity with one of my longtime clients over 10 years ago now to help out with setting up the program and the processes they needed to collect and aggregate data for the first sustainability report. And then from there, I had the opportunity to get deep into the Global Reporting Initiative and later had the opportunity to do a pro bono project with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And it's just really interesting to see all of the attention we're seeing now on sustainability reporting or ESG reporting from a number of angles. So we're very excited to have this opportunity today. So first to start, I have learned that it's always best when talking about ESG and sustainability to level set at the beginning, as not everyone comes to the discussion with the same background or definition in our heads of what ESG or sustainability means. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, and it originally came from the risks and opportunities that investors began many years ago to start to incorporate into their decision making. And it really has morphed into be frequently being used as synonymous with sustainability. And that's a broad definition of sustainability that includes social and governance topics, and in addition to environmental. So today I'll try to use the word sustainability, I'll try to use the word ESG actually, but I've already caught myself a few times using sustainability, but I'm using those synonymously. And just to level set on the type of topics we're talking about when we think about environmental, social, and governance categories. One example, there's many universes out there that will categorize different risks and issues and topics into the three buckets. This is just one of them. This is MSCI's ESG rating and key issue framework. And if you're not familiar, MSCI ESG is one of the largest providers of ESG data and ratings to investors. And they, like many of the others, have on an industry or a sector of the economy basis, determined material issues. And what you can see here with the boxes around them, the dotted boxes, are the topics that MSCI, just MSCI, has indicated as applicable or relevant to the food products, the beverages, and the household and personal products industries. Those three industries, the topics are largely aligned, but they'll be depending on the industry you operate in, and many of you operate in multiple, there'll be one or two issues that MSCI has not designated for you. Now, it's important to think about just because MSCI doesn't necessarily consider, was my screen there? Thank you. But just because MSCI does not consider it to be a key issue for their ratings, that doesn't mean that the topic isn't material to the issue, material to your company. So there are other topics that you may have stakeholders that do care about. And I apologize that I think you guys weren't seeing my screen there. I must not have clicked the final button to get it sharing here in Zoom. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, please. So as you're aware, I'm sure you've got investors and other stakeholders like your employees and increasingly your customers all thinking about a broad base of topics beyond those topics that I just mentioned briefly with the boxes around them, topics like carbon emissions and human capital development, topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion have really risen to the top as expectations by stakeholder groups for all companies. When we think about the different forces, many of them that are bringing ESG and ESG reporting to the forefront, we've summarized a couple of them here. So starting with investors, I already mentioned investors on the last slide. Many of you have probably seen various reports and ways of cutting the data that shows that sustainable investing was way up in 2020, significantly higher than it was in the previous year, which was already a record year. And that's despite the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, NGOs and activists have often played a role in bringing ESG issues to the forefront at our companies. And you may have some experiences, both good and bad with that. But what we're definitely seeing is climate action being an area of focus today. But of course, there are many others, topics of interest, such as packaging and waste. Moving around the dial here to employees, hopefully you all have great stories of enthusiasm and really just a great grassroots efforts around environmental and social topics within your employee ranks. And increasingly, many surveys, this is just one, show that employees of the generations that now combined already make up the majority of the workforce, these employees and potential employees look to a company's purpose or values to be aligned with their own when they're making an employment decision. Probably the hottest topic today on ESG reporting is regulators. So depending on your role, you may have been following recent SEC announcements or statements and speeches related to potential for climate change disclosure. They've gone out with a request for comment on that just last month, as well as comments on, as well as speeches that have talked about the role of broader ESG disclosure and the SEC's role in it. So lots of unanswered questions here, but probably more to come. And it's really one of the things that we're seeing our clients taking steps to prepare now for the potential for increased focus of the SEC later. And last but the next one around here is society. And what's really been interesting about this over the past year is that there's a lot of interesting observations out there on the parallels between the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. So for most of us, or at least for me, we didn't have experience living during a pandemic prior to this. We had heard about pandemics during our lifetime, but they didn't affect us. And we considered it a high impact, low likelihood event that we were unlikely to experience in our lifetimes. In the case of climate change, we have been warned about the likelihood of negative impacts with scientific consensus. So we probably shouldn't even consider it a low likelihood. So there's definitely some thought behind that now. A broader cross section of society may be more focused on climate change and not waiting to experience the worst impacts of climate change before we take more aggressive action, given that we've lived this very devastating human and economic event over the past year plus now. Now, last but not least, consumers. So hopefully you have similar findings to our survey that we're highlighting here, that consumers are increasingly noting that they consider themselves a sustainable shopper through a variety of definitions. And if we broaden that lens to retail and corporate customers, business to business customers, many of you have probably already felt the impact of voluntary, or sometimes it feels more like mandatory, ESG disclosure requirements, and often specifically carbon disclosure requirements. For example, just this morning, I saw some new news on this, that Salesforce will be introducing new requirements for their suppliers to set science-based emission reduction targets that are aligned with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or less. So I think probably more to come here as business to business customers focus on their supply chain. We can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So shifting gears to thinking about what you can do and how ESG can be leveraged to tell your company's story. So while many times I know ESG reporting can seem like an additional burden, perhaps a compliance exercise, there's a number of things to consider, ways that ESG and ESG reporting can be leveraged to provide benefits. So we've listed a couple of them here. First being visibility and focus on what matters most. So those risks and opportunities where there's value at stake for your company is hopefully an outcome of taking an approach to ESG reporting that's focused on materiality and your stakeholder ecosystem, including investors. That's where the foundation for your reporting versus reporting on everything possible to report on, which brings to clarity around what needs to be reported, how and when. One of the things that makes ESG reporting overwhelming is the large number of topics that you could potentially report on, but really thinking about what matters most can help you hone in there. And then next, alignment across your company's leadership on an ESG reporting framework and an approach, and support needed for working towards credible data. So data that you can confidently consider to use in additional channels, perhaps even beyond your ESG report, to incorporate ESG into both the way you work throughout the organization and ways that you engage with employees, customers, consumers. And then the last couple points continue to get to that point of credibility of data. So probably the number one thing we hear from clients around ESG and ESG reporting is that things along the lines of, we don't trust the data. I don't understand where it's coming from. We don't know if we've captured all of it. We don't know if we've captured it accurately. There's so many spreadsheets is a common comment. So really, in terms of working forward, thinking about how you break through this barrier, this data barrier to ESG reporting, that also can help you around goal setting and performance management and launching strategies and investments aimed at reducing the negative impacts that may be associated with your value chain or bolstering the positive ones. So focusing on high quality ESG reporting can also give you other benefits in terms of data that can be leveraged for decision making internally as well. Please move forward. Thank you. So when we think about how to do this, so how to get to that future state where you have enhanced visibility and clarity on exactly what's at stake and when and who and how to report and comfort in your data, one of the first steps is to really approach ESG reporting as an overall cross-functional exercise. So when companies embed ESG into your overall strategy, your risk functions, your operations, you're being better able to talk about the value creation story associated with ESG in your ESG reporting and really shape that narrative that forms the description of your brand and your practices and how you're managing your environmental and social and governance impacts. When you think about ESG reporting, what often happens is it's left to really one person as the main driver, or a small team. It's considered their problem to get out the door. When that happens, many facets of the company's likely very complex and multi-layered story around ESG might be missed or only touched upon superficially. Yesterday, I was talking to a client about, they asked me why I thought their MSCI ESG rating was so low. And I looked into it and saw that they got almost no points under product safety and quality. Clearly, for most companies, product safety and quality is definitely a focus, but in this particular case, it was an area that wasn't integrated at all into their ESG planning and disclosure. So by leaving it off to the side, this company is potentially causing the company to be excluded from some of those sustainable investing opportunity trends that I mentioned earlier today. And that's an example right there. It's not because of an absence of an approach to manage that social topic. They just weren't looping it into their ESG story. So to make sure you're covering off on all the relevant material pieces, it is important to have that cross-functional representation involved in embedding ESG into the corporate strategy, your ways of working and reporting. So a couple ways to do this that some of you are already doing, but they include a cross-functional ESG council that actually meets and has plans and doesn't get deprioritized for whatever the latest fire is. even organizational-wide training at most levels to help with embedding sustainability or ESG into the ways of working, no matter what department people are in. And then, of course, many of you have heard about or may be experiencing compensation incentives related to ESG as well. Next slide, please. All right, so back to that focusing on what matters most point. So another thing we often hear about ESG reporting is that there's a lot of noise. So one of the most critical things to do in order to be able to leverage ESG reporting to tell your story, not somebody else's, not the standards of the rating agencies, is to cut through all that noise and arrive at an ESG framework that captured those ESG focus areas for you, those that matter the most to your company and your stakeholders. And it's important to agree that framework or ESG strategy with across company leadership so it can serve as guiding principles for how you prioritize and invest your time. So a couple things in terms of how to actually do this. Like I said, the volume is overwhelming. It's an alphabet soup collection of frameworks, standards, other guidance out there. But once you get into the details or have someone walk you through the details, you learn that there is a lot of overlap and not all of the standards are as relevant to certain stakeholder groups like investors as other standards. And when you really start to dig into it, certain topics or issues will quickly rise to the top. Often our clients, another area to really think about how to do this is often our clients will be hesitant or it's not the right time to reach out for external stakeholder engagement to help you weed through that noise on what's most important to different stakeholder groups. We found it's really possible to get some great information internally. So identify information you already have that represents the perspectives of stakeholder groups from within the company. Of course, you've got a wealth of information on employee thoughts, but you've got teams that understand your customers really well. You have teams that understand your regulators well. So see what you can harvest internally to still, even without going outside, to get a widespread representation of what stakeholders think matters to your company. And then lastly, really make sure to use the sector lens or investor viewpoints that are available in many of the different standards and frameworks to give yourself permission to not report on every single topic possible. At one point, I think there definitely was a move that some were thinking more topics, more data points are better, but it's really better to focus on what matters most to you, but recognize what the expectations are so you're not leaving out topics that and stakeholder groups that are important to you, like perhaps investors might be looking at. Next slide, please. So after arriving at the topics that matter the most to your company, then you really need to think about the data. So you've arrived at the topics that matter. You want to link those into your strategy. You do need to think about KPIs to tell your story. And of course, data is at the center of meaningful ESG reporting that does truly represent your story in a meaningful way. But it's certainly not a simple thing to capture. We all know that the ESG data exists in a multitude of data sources across the company from business partners, and a lot of it is in spreadsheets or different point solutions, and it's pretty hard to get at. So credible data really requires a combination of thinking about process and controls around that data collection, leveraging technology and tools, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on all of these. And then really importantly, people who understand the importance of data collection and validation, the activities the company's laid out, the processes that have been set, and the tools that are available or expected to be used. Well, oftentimes we'll find that a company might have really made a good effort to try to set up some guardrails, some rules, some process, even some tools to use. But if it doesn't get enforced beyond just a kickoff meeting and say, go everyone, use this, that it doesn't actually get applied or it's not fully understood. So that's that bottom here of underscored by change management and upskilling. And we'll talk a little bit more there. So let's dig into this a little bit more on the next page here, please. So in terms of tactically, how to get started thinking about improving the data that you have available to you to tell your story, improve your ESG reporting. One of the areas you want to think about is information governance framework. So this will allow you to have additional rigor around how you collect ESG data, bring it together, and disclose it, and hopefully build some of that confidence, or the lack of confidence I mentioned earlier that we commonly hear, that our clients don't feel comfortable or can't necessarily trust all of their data. So when we think about information governance, we're first thinking about overarching approach and what we're calling here program level standards. So these are the type of things that would apply to all ESG data and information that is reported. So it would include things like broad requirements around boundary and scope and calculation guidance that needs to be observed by all owners. It also includes things like roles and responsibilities. Often when we're working with clients on this, it entails also introducing roles or responsibilities that weren't there before. For example, layers of different review and certification based around the data and its quality. A couple other things that our clients definitely focus on here is differentiating different data pieces. So you've got metrics or KPIs that are, let's say, linked to a standard or linked to a corporate goal. But you probably do have some other quantitative data that just helps you tell the story. And you might even have statements of fact as well. You might set up in these overarching standards how there's a different level of process and control that apply to these different types of information reported, that you can then align, for example, with an internal audit group that might be helping you of the different requirements based on the different level of risk associated there. So moving right here from those overarching standards into ESG topic guidance and metric level documentation. And what we're talking about here at the topic level is really just groups of metrics. So they're often, for example, like energy and emissions will be grouped together, or at the goal level if there's a number of metrics that fall under. And these are things that share some common characteristics, like the data elements, like the boundary, and it's just reducing redundant effort to have them in one document. And then that leads it into the more detailed documentation at the metric level that would have a process flow, a controls framework, and a narrative about how the data is to be collected. That documentation, you definitely want to consider thinking about what actually is the calculation that's involved in this metric, and then therefore what are each of those data sources that must come together, and where are we getting them from? That will allow you to build and increase some of the tools at your disposal around the rigor and the comfort that you have behind that. And these tools can be an important tool. And if I'm the data collection person and I need to go to someone to review it, it will really lay out the framework for how the person that needs to review the data that I pulled together should go about doing that. As I mentioned before, last but not least, definitely need to focus on employee adoption of this framework. It's not enough to throw together some Word documents and say, everybody fill this out. Really have to help people through the process, as well as continue that upskilling throughout the journey. And then at the same time, one of the things that's important to consider in terms of being able to tell your story how and when you want is leveraging technology. So thinking about data and analytics technology that you probably already have within your organization that might be able to help you report on a more timely basis, perhaps internally on a more timely basis, might be able to report faster towards the end of the year externally, and then hopefully help you with automating some of that data collection that when done manually could be prone to errors. And that's what we're really talking about here in this first step of establishing the ESG data and analytics vision. So what are those capabilities that you wish you had around ESG reporting that may be able to be enabled with technology? Moving from there, taking those capabilities and mapping them to the data value chain. So how data is sourced and stored and consumed, and thinking about what tools you already have in your infrastructure that exists. And then lastly, prioritizing initiatives to help you achieve some of those capabilities. As I mentioned, in many cases, you already may have tools that can help with the technology enablement of ESG. So you should consider the infrastructure you already have around data lakes, around tools that support financial reporting. And a critical thing to think about in terms of how to do this is to not go it alone. So working with your IT team and getting that cross-functional input about what might be possible really goes a long way, and helps, of course, with that prioritization and where you can fit in the investment. Likewise, for the information governance piece, the top row I discussed, don't go alone there either. Many of these things you might be thinking, depending on your role, wow, we already have a lot of this. It exists in our internal controls over financial reporting program. And if you have something that can be leveraged or embedded there, that's great. So thinking about working cross-functionally between the ESG team, finance, internal audit, legal, others involved, hope many times you already have something in place that you can leverage there. We can move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of rolling out an information governance program or even technology, it can be pretty daunting. Some of you may be thinking, wow, we have hundreds of ESG metrics. So this would take a really long time to document a process flow and narrative and controls framework for each. And that is true. So like really anything, it's important to take a prioritized or risk-based approach to doing that. And that's what we're illustrating here. We happen to have a tool that's called ESG Pulse, but this is also something that you can consider on your own, showing you here those categories of what we would look at in terms of policies and procedures, data management, calculations and estimations, control design and review, and consolidation and disclosure. So these are 5 categories to look at for each metric. How are you performing on those? We've got a scale to assess that. And at the end, it would let you understand that, all right, well, we've been focused on, let's say, our energy data for quite some time. And we do have a decent policy. We probably have a little bit more work to do around data management, given an acquisition or something like that. But you might be fearing, okay, there could be new data points or new metrics that you're reporting that you really don't necessarily have as much infrastructure around that you want to prioritize first. So this is just one way to do it, is really understand the risk at a metric by metric level. So you can compare across metrics and direct your attention accordingly. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a couple of times that employee adoption is critical. And what this illustrates, and I won't walk through every point on here, is really just thinking about a well-rounded way to engage the large group of data owners that you have throughout the organization that you rely on to help you tell your story. And they come from all different functions, given the wide range of topics covered under the ESG umbrella. So what we're illustrating here is one of our concepts of drip feed learning. And these are, you might even have trouble seeing on your screen, so hopefully you can see it in the materials afterwards. But thinking about really not overwhelming, but hitting this large group of people involved in ESG data from different angles. One, hearing from them, letting them give you feedback on what it is that they need more attention on, what it is that they're not experiencing they're not really appreciating the experience of that you could consider in your program, but also just thinking about a network for them to connect with one another and provide best practices. There might be seemingly unrelated topics. There might be best practices that the data collection teams can share with one another. And then in some cases, really need to dig into the details. So as I mentioned, working with clients before to build out those detailed documentation of what is the calculation, what is the data elements that go into that calculation, where are they from, what are the risks, process and documentation. That's where roadshows might be necessary to really get in and get hands-on with a smaller group of people that will be involved. And don't just kind of set it and forget it. You've got to go back. Teams change, but really making sure that people understand the processes that are expected for collecting that ESG data that is so critical to telling your story, and making sure that they're really embedded versus filling out a Word document that seems like an administrative exercise. We provided some other examples here as well. But one of the things we found through experiences with the clients that we worked with years ago and have come back for various reasons now to maybe, for example, take a look at how they're still performing against the templates. You do find people that say, well, you know, I never really understood this. The person in the job before me said it was something we need to pay attention to, but they didn't really get it either. So really thinking about ways to make sure that they're truly understanding the importance of for example, maintaining evidence. It will often be an area that when I'm on the consulting side, but we do some audits or over environmental, social, and governance data. And that's one thing I hear from them is that even many times if the process was followed, there might not be the evidence to back it up because there just wasn't simply the understanding, or there wasn't great tools available for the person to retain that evidence. We can move forward. So I wanted to just give you a couple more perspectives here. But this also won't drain this here, but one of the things that we see as big shifts in the last 5 years is companies looking to really move up this maturity curve as it stands for ESG reporting and their overall ESG program. So really thinking about leading first. So, what would that look like? So you've got data that much of it, maybe not all of it, but is actually sitting and sourced in enterprise reporting systems with an actual sound architecture behind it and processes to support it. And there's a clear source that people know what it is to go to for ESG data and metrics. And then that allows for much more frequent reporting and analytics to inform the internal decision making that I talked about. So it really, you could have a great analytical tool, but if you don't have quality data to go below it, it's not of much use. So that's where you would go towards to get towards leaning, and of course supported by a process that has documented policy procedures, and there's clear certification over that data at the appropriate point in time. So that's kind of the best practice in most companies when it comes to, if you think about the wide swath of topics or metrics that they're reporting on, certainly don't have this for all of them. There's some we work with now that are starting to get there for some of them, but many more wouldn't be able to say that they've got that environment for any of their metrics, again, because the crux of a lot of this data isn't from financial systems or even operational systems. There's a lot of spreadsheets involved and kind of point solutions. So most companies, even those that have been reporting on ESG data for a long time, are more in that limited or evolving space, and definitely looking to make their lives a little bit easier by moving towards the right. And it is important to note, I'm not suggesting that means all of their data is bad, what they're publishing. Lots of times you see very dedicated teams that spend a lot of time and a lot of hard work trying to get to that point of that they're comfortable with the data, but they could really benefit or would be looking forward to tools that help automate some of that data collection and that validation and make their lives a little bit easier, and actually be able to focus more on the storytelling aspect versus the brute force effort of trying to manage many spreadsheets and not mix anything up. You can go ahead. So really to wrap this up, we'll just leave you with our framework in terms of overall approach to an integrated proactive ESG report is trying to address some of the things we've talked about today, where many of our clients feel that their reporting is in a silo and it's not necessarily focused on particular topics, and of course very reactive to that future, where you can really think about and pave the way of what's the story we want to tell. You've got clear roles and responsibility throughout the organization for helping to tell that story, as well as the cross-functional input, but you're aligned on the priorities and you've got a plan to do so. So kind of the building blocks of that include that strategic framework, which is everything from the narrative, the metrics, and the content. Those processes I keep harping on here in terms of how to tell your story, but the ways you collect and consolidate and then ultimately disclose data. Risk and controls, thinking about where your risks are, and you consider that from a couple angles that I've mentioned, both of simply absence of controls, but also in terms of importance to stakeholders, as well as designing those controls. Digital platform, so thinking about lots of opportunities. One of the things our clients are excited about once they get their arms around that data is how they can get it to different stakeholder groups and think about other audiences beyond just, let's say, a PDF ESG report would reach. And then lastly, governance, of course, thinking about that cross-functional operating model and those standards and policies that support. So I think, Ellen, we are ready for some questions, if you are.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julie. That was, let's see, hold on a second. Technology. Thank you, Julie. But what a terrific presentation that I think really laid the groundwork for why this is such an important issue for companies today. We do have some questions that came in through the chat. If you don't mind, I might just take those one at a time. And if others have questions, please feel free to continue to write into the chat. The first question is really about how the new regulatory and political environment is, how you see that changing environment, changing the way that companies should think about ESG and their initiatives in this space. What do you see coming, and what should be on their mind as they're kind of trying to evaluate this new landscape?
Yeah, and we do see, I would say, an increased amount of outreach on some of the topics we talked about today of, well, and really coming from different functions. So, and particularly given the spaces that we operate, but financial reporting or controllership or other group internal audit coming to us and saying, I was kind of aware of this ESG report or the sustainability report, but I didn't pay that much attention to it. But now I'm hearing or I'm reading actual statements coming from the SEC about the importance of ESG reporting to investors, and probably also hearing some rumors on top of that that aren't necessarily confirmed about the potential for regulation around ESG reporting. And then there's the other angle of claims, or whether it's a regulatory claim that might get more scrutiny from a regulatory body, but even just from employees or activists under you could use the greenwashing umbrella. Just more awareness of saying, wait a minute, I know we've been putting this data out, but where does it come from? So in terms of how they're thinking about it, really does come down to some of the things that we talked about today is, let's step back and think about all of the stuff we're putting out there. And one of the angles I didn't really talk about is also considering the risk of some of the information that's out there, and maybe not making claims with as little support as it had done it in the past. Really thinking about that there could be different audiences is there. And specifically, tactically, one of the ways companies can do that is inventorying all your data points, all your claims beyond in your ESG report, but beyond websites, social media, and really thinking about, is this the message that we want to put out there? And can it be supported? But on the positive side, also using it to hopefully, many of the companies represented today do have really great initiatives or programs in place to address some of the things we're talking about. Also making sure you've got the data that can truly support those stories as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Right, we're starting to get a bunch of questions now, Julie. So I'm like I said, I'm just going to take these one at a time if that works for you.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question. For privately held companies, are there data standards and reporting schemes which might be more relevant than those targeted at publicly traded companies? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something really just in the last couple of months, I've talked to more private companies than ever before, actually. So in terms of the standards, so for example, Global Reporting Initiative is not, it's multi-stakeholder, right? So it's not specifically investor-based. I would say even for a private company, though, taking a look at investor-oriented standards like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, it's still a good guidepost for you, because the thought process behind that was they evaluated through participants in the industry, research, other contributors to that, of what are those topics that do have the risk and opportunities that are most closely correlated with long-term value creation. And that still applies to your company, even though you don't have independent investors or outside investors, those still apply. You can think about those as a guide for areas to focus your efforts and your reporting. You don't necessarily need to use their standard in terms of like an index if you're not looking to get your information easily to investors, but it still is good input. And one of the things I think, it's just a hunch, some of the increased attention at private companies on ESG right now is because we do see more and more claims and press releases about, let's say, net zero targets or other ambitious carbon reduction coming from the public companies because they're getting pressure from investors to do so. But then there's the peer pressure for the private companies that for example, CEO might say, well, wait a minute, why are those guys? Don't we have one of those? So, should we talk about it too? So again, that is not a research-based response there, but that's my hunch that some of the peer pressure is coming into play of saying, wow, I guess we may, even though we're not trying to appease or appeal to an investor audience, we need to think about how we tell our story as well.
Yep, very good, very helpful. One question is, can you talk more about how to disguise ESG versus sustainability, with sustainability, so often seen as an environmental issue?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer to this. I had a call with a major technology provider this morning. We had about 5 PwC partners on, and they had about 5 people. And that really was a topic, because someone mentioned, well, we're talking about sustainability, not ESG. And so I was like, well, I think those mean the same thing. So it's actually just important in your disclosure, and then of course conversations with your stakeholders, is just to be clear on what aspect you're talking. Try to avoid talking in generalities, to talk about the particular topics. In terms of the pressures we see, I've probably given a lot of environmental examples today, and that is where we see a lot of pressure, particularly around carbon reduction targets or net zero or ambitious carbon reduction. Definitely a focus there, but as most of you also have felt pressured, there are social topics that have lots of attention these days as well, such as diversity, equity, inclusion, and disclosure, of course, but also what are you doing to think about your performance in those areas. So definitely focus on environmental sustainability side, but also focus across the board.
Yep. So I'll take that opportunity to segue into another question, which you just touched on. I know PwC is very much a leader right now, especially on social justice issues. I've got the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion, which we were proud to sign. Many of our member companies have been as well. One of the big topics today among the CEOs that we work with is on how companies can be thinking about taking a stand on social issues. One question here is, how much do you see companies taking a stand on social issues impacting ESG reporting? My hunch is, how do they go hand in hand? How are they separate? How are you guys navigating that with some of the discussion with some of the companies you work with?
Yeah, I think that actually comes back to some of having that clear, agreed across the company framework, whether you call it ESG or sustainability, or even better embedded in your corporate strategy, because that is one area of risk, or sometimes we get calls, particularly from the corporate secretary side of things, about an imbalance. Somebody's come out with an announcement from one part of the organization, but it's not perfectly aligned with what was reported just 2 months ago in a standalone sustainability or ESG report. So I definitely would always recommend an integrated framework. And that's not to say nothing can ever change, because you're going to set your framework. You need to revisit it. And maybe there have been events over the past year that have caused the company to take more of a stand or focus on equity than was originally contemplated in, let's say, diversity and inclusion initiatives. Mm-hmm. And you'll want to go back and revisit that framework, but definitely as soon as opportunity presents, would suggest looping those in. And we have seen cases where different institutional investors have actually seen public facing announcements and said, wait a minute, we want to see performance on this. You're saying this is what you support and this is what you stand for, but you don't disclose even the diversity of your own employee base or leadership team. So how are you backing up this statement?
I also really liked the slide, and this gets into another question, demonstrating all of the different kind of lenses inside the company that could be, should be thinking about and focusing on ESG. One of the questions here, and I think maybe especially focused on an industry that has many different types of employees, some working in a corporate office, some working in a manufacturing facility, many global. Your slide was on employee adoption. And this question is, how do you define employee adoption? What does that look like? And then maybe if I could also add on, how do you bring employees along on your ESG journey?
Yeah, great question. And in the slide today, I was actually focusing around those that have a role in the reporting process. Yeah. But a whole other topic, and actually probably more fun, is thinking about embedding sustainability throughout the company at all levels for those in very different roles. Those of us who used to go to an office every day, compared to those that actually haven't been staying home for the past year and had to work in very difficult circumstances. How do you really bring it to life and engage the base? So there's a couple things we've seen out there. We're actually working on a solution that will ultimately be available to clients, but we'll use it with ourselves is a school of ESG. So, with our employee base, of course, it's office type employee, but involved in professional services of consulting, auditing, and tax, but really understanding what ESG is and then how it relates to maybe what they do. And like I said, that's something we'll bring to clients, and it's something we've worked with clients on before. As far back as 2012, I actually worked with a client around going back to the digital channels. There's so many options there. Back then, it was a PowerPoint deck that they designated different people around this I don't know, 10,000 person company to go deliver. They did not deliver it to their hourly workers in their manufacturing facilities, but the others, to really think about what does ESG mean? Because we're all thinking different things. Even what does environmental sustainability mean? Where is the company focused? And just trying to get that mindset so that we're all contributing.
That's very helpful, and you're right. I think we've had just some conversations lately of both the leaders in the company that are focused on ESG, but then also how you make sure that every employee understands the path forward of the company, even if they're not involved in the day-to-day and directly contributing.
One of the things we've tried to do with our workforce, specifically around the employee adoption, really just the continued upskilling, because I guess we're not measuring adoption on it, it's just bite-sized consumption chunks. So as a podcast that, well, I used to listen to when I was driving to the office or the airport, but 7 minutes that somebody can squeeze in when they're commuting or need a mental break, combined with articles at a different time, and of course some formal trainings of 2 p.m. on Friday. Please join this webcast, as well as talking to each other. So I think another key thing, not specifically on the data collection side of things, but on the overall embracing the mindset of whatever it is that the company's ESG strategy is giving the forum to discuss, which is obviously very important on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues as well.
All right, I've got 2 more questions here, and then we'll let you off the hook. This one looks at ESG from a legal perspective. So here's a question. From a legal perspective, there's difficulty navigating this because of the lack of unified ESG standards. And that may change, but how can companies navigate this uncertainty and fill voids where federal agencies haven't sufficiently led?
Yeah, and that's where we'd suggest, and we do work with a lot of legal teams, but definitely that has certainly increased over the last couple of years as well, where before it would be more of a standalone sustainability team or communications, and we've seen some companies that have removed ESG reporting from a communications function and put it over to legal. On the lack of unified ESG standards, as Ellen said, things only move so fast, but there are some initiatives around IFRS, for example, and international financial reporting standards, to think about a unified system. What a lot of our public companies are really focused on right now, and you may have read this in the letter from Larry Fink of BlackRock, is definitely a focus on SASB and TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, really being areas of immediate focus and getting that credible data in place, that data infrastructure, that you're comfortable with where the data came from, that it's been certified, that you can stand behind it. Really just being a starting point, and then using things like GRI or the WEF, stakeholder capitalism metrics, to round out the disclosure in areas. But generally, we see companies who care about the question that was just asked trying to point to a standard versus a metric that came up with on their own.
Yeah. All right. So the last question, and then we'll wrap up, is our industry, CPG, many of them are looking at maybe their competitor set or other kind of companies in a similar category beyond CPG. Can you talk about whether you see any industries doing this well? If you were a CPG company, which company in another industry, or which industry maybe, would you look to for inspiration on somebody that might be a little bit more progressive or advanced than certain companies in this industry are?
It's a great question, and I haven't really had it before. So I think generally you do see CPG companies that you can point to as leading practices, of course, you don't know about the plumbing underneath until I talk to them and they say, oh my gosh, it looks good, but that was so hard. I lost years off my life over the last 2 months trying to get it together. Though I'll mention a couple. So I'm actually Detroit based, and in addition, the other consumer product that I spend time with is automotive. So you can see the automakers as examples of extremely robust reporting, but also probably they've been at it for a very, very long time. So they're also they were more under that era of the pressures of reporting every single thing in GRI, and some of that did come from peer competitors, as you see. When you think about the automaker makeup, there's only a couple of US companies, the rest are Europe and Asia that have had different pressures or different focuses here. They do, one best practice I would say across several automakers is making it easy to get at the data. So a navigation bar that lets you get to the different standards. If they do have an index for GRI, for SASB, their TCFD reporting, the list goes on of making it just really easy for the user, investors, to also to find the data. But some of the technology companies have definitely some leading practices around integrated reporting or just innovative reporting, like SAP or Salesforce.
Very helpful, thank you. All right, so let's wrap up this session today. Julie, thank you so much for your time. I think you provided some really valuable insights to those who were able to join us. And thank you to PwC for their partnership with the Consumer Brands Association. We look forward to sharing additional insights from PwC during future sessions and other initiatives. Some big takeaways from this session for me, as Julie mentioned, ESG reporting is quickly becoming a cross-functional activity inside the organization that makes your company better positioned to drive your narrative. This reporting has accelerated tremendously in the last 5 years and will likely continue in that direction. And I suppose if I took anything away from this, Julie, this is hard. And this landscape is changing quickly. I think you're probably considered a veteran since you've been involved in this for as many years as you have. Not too many folks have probably been looking at this, for the amount of tenure that you have. And it's just incredible to think how much this will continue to change.
Yeah, and probably more rapidly.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Really all right. Well, thanks again, Julie. For those of you on the call, next Thursday, May 6th at 2 p.m., we will be holding another industry solutions session on understanding the behaviors of the digitally native consumer, presented by Instacart. A link to registration is available in the chat. Thanks again for joining today's session, and Julie, for your time. Take care, everybody.